Hey Tech Policy Grind, this is Emory, here to let you know that all this week we'll be releasing some very special bonus episodes of Tech Policy Grind. Last week, Joe and I found ourselves at State of the Net 2018, the largest internet policy conference in the country, hosted by our parent organization, the Internet Education Foundation. Throughout the day, we got to talk to some incredibly interesting people doing work at the very edges of internet policy. Today, we'll start things off with our first discussion of the day, where we were joined by James Bessen and Charles Duan to talk about the implications of automation, robotics, and the economy. James Bessen is the Executive Director of the Technology and Policy Research Initiative at Boston University School of Law, and Charles Duan has a title that's long enough that I'll just leave it to Joe to introduce properly at the beginning of the interview. Suffice to say that Charles is an attorney at Public Knowledge and an incredible writer and thinker on some of the fascinating issues facing law and technology today. We are so thrilled to be trying out something a little new here at Tech Policy Grind, and we can't wait to hear what you think. So sit back, relax, or continue to drive, or do whatever you were doing previously, this is podcasting after all, and enjoy our discussion with Charles Duan and James Bessen at State of the Net 2018.
Hey everyone, this is Emory here with Tech Policy Grind in DC at the State of the Net conference. This is the Internet Education Foundation's 14th annual State of the Net, the largest internet policy conference in the country. We're sitting here with Joe as well as our excellent guests, Charles Duan and James Bessen. Joe, do you want to introduce our guests a little bit better?
So we've got James. He is the Executive Director at the Technology Policy and Research Initiative at Boston University School of Law. I used to go to BU, so go Terriers. And then we have Charles Duan, who has another mouthful of a title, the Associate Director of Tech and Innovation Policy at R Street. R Street is an organization that CET works pretty closely with, so we're happy to have them both here.
Great to be here.
So we were actually, before we started recording, having a really great conversation about artificial intelligence and what it means for, I guess, the future of work or the future of all of us having jobs. So I guess, you know what, James, I'll start with you. Are the robots coming for our jobs?
Good question. I think many people think they're approaching this as sort of what's called the robot panic. People are worried that we'll be out of work, and some people are predicting that in 10 or 20 years, 47% of all occupations will be at risk of automation. Poppycock, I say.
Is that because your job won't be at risk?
I won't be working there. Right. The story is this. In the next 10 or 20 years, artificial intelligence, robots are going to be very disruptive to our society, but it's not because they're going to be eliminating jobs on the whole. When you think about automation, people automatically assume that automation means jobs will be lost. And that's not necessarily true. Automation can create jobs. And in fact, if you look historically, we tend to think about manufacturing. And you look from the mid-20th century, the number of manufacturing jobs has declined dramatically. In 1940, there were over 400,000 textile workers in the U.S. Today, there are something like 16,000. Dramatic drop, and most of that is due to technology. Some of it to global trade, but most of it to technology. What we forget, however, is that for the 100 years prior to that, from the early 19th century, a heavy rate of automation was accompanied by strong job growth. We didn't get to 400,000 textile workers, except because the automation that was put in place then was creating jobs. And we're seeing the same sort of thing now. So there's a question, why is that? Why did things change? And will they, what do we face today? And the reason has to do with demand for the product. So back in the early 19th century, the average person had one set of clothes. And when the price of cloth went down because of automation, they bought a bunch more. They bought a lot more. And so if you look over the 19th century, they increased the per capita consumption of cloth went up over tenfold, almost 20-fold. That meant that the demand for cloth, was growing faster than the labor-saving effect of the automation, and so the net number of jobs went up. You come to the mid-20th century, and everybody's got lots of clothes. The closet's full of clothes. They're using cloth draperies, cloth upholstery, and automation is still chugging along, bringing productivity benefits, but now there's not much more demand that it brings about. And as a result, the labor-saving effect dominates and jobs are reduced.
Okay.
But it's a long arc of history to think about. Look today at what's happening. The question is, are these new technologies going into areas where there's large pent-up demand that's not being met? And in lots of areas, particularly the service economy, finance, healthcare, there is lots of pent-up demand. And so what you see, my favorite example is the bank teller and the ATM. Everybody has assumed that the automated teller machine would come in and eliminate the bank teller. So between 1995 and 2005, you had this huge influx of almost 500,000 ATM machines. And what happened to the bank tellers? Their jobs actually went up.
So can I push back against that for a second? Because that's a common anecdote that I've heard over and over again about the bank. I think Google's Eric Schmidt used that.
Well, I'm the guy who
the author. So I guess my understanding is, you're right, like the demand goes up, more and more jobs, but then eventually something tails off. And I was looking at statistics. I think the Bureau of Labor suggests that bank tellers are actually supposed to decrease by 2024 and then moving down.
Yeah, the ATM wasn't the only machine that's affecting bank tellers. I mean, you're talking the BLS projections. Sometimes they're right and sometimes they're not, and there's some very famous cases where they've been wrong. But so you have online banking is affecting the banking industry in various ways. I think the main point is we're seeing lots of technologies. Some of them are going to eliminate jobs. Many of them are actually going to be creating jobs.
So what type of jobs?
Yeah.
What should we all be doing?
It's
Save me.
First off, it's going to be in sectors where there is large pent-up demand. It's going to be more in the service sector than in manufacturing, for instance. So the effect of robots is not necessarily going to increase jobs. It's probably more likely decreasing jobs. I mean, we see in our empirical work evidence that that's the pattern.
So which technologies are we likely to see reach that sort of escape velocity where it's creating more jobs than destroying?
I think you're seeing lots of things in finance, in healthcare, in the service sector where that's the case.
Charles, do you have anything?
Well, so I'm a lawyer, so automation in the law has always been something that's very interesting to me, and I know that you've used the law as an example in terms of discovery, where the fact that we started automating some of the discovery processes means that we can actually do law more efficiently, which means that people can hire more lawyers because the cases are less costly to prosecute or to defend, and I think there are a lot of really interesting opportunities in that area, at least, where you don't have so much computers taking over the jobs of lawyers, but you have computers assisting lawyers, you have computers working together with lawyers.
And there's a huge demand there. I mean, the legal gap is larger than ever
exactly.
before.
Exactly. I mean, right now we're facing a situation where legal services are incredibly expensive and, really only reachable by, big companies or, very wealthy people. And the opportunities for combining automation processes with human services, I think really democratize the process and allow people to get more involved in the legal system in ways that they haven't before. I've seen a lot of attempts at for example building systems for fighting parking tickets, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's so things like that I think are really good examples of where automation can work with human input in ways that are really effective. I think one of the other areas that we're looking at that's interesting is customer service, right? Where, when we're facing new technologies, they're not easy to use a lot of the times. And we're going to need a lot of people to, help figure out just how these are going to work.
Really?
I think that's going to be a fairly big industry.
Can I push back on that a little, though? Because, I feel like I have gone through periods of my life where I needed to sit down for hours and try to teach my grandparents or my parents how to check email. But today, with smartphones, my dad will take photographs as he's driving, which is insane. I mean, this is,
also unsafe.
Unsafe, yes. Dad, this is for you. Please stop doing that. I feel like the ethos of design is seeping into technology so much that we're not really seeing the situation where the technology is getting more difficult to use. If anything, it feels like it's getting easier.
Sure. I think that in a lot of situations it is getting easier in terms of just consumer products. But for example, I have to spend hours on the phone talking to or waiting for somebody to talk to at Comcast, right? I think that there are a lot of opportunities for improving that system. That's never going to be a fully automated system, right? We're always going to want to have a human there. The first thing I do when I call most of these call centers is I say, give me an operator, give me a real person, right? We need a real person.
Press the 0 button until it transfers you through the operator.
So I think there are a lot of situations where we expect a person, or having a person there is really helpful, but there's a lot that automation can do to help that process, to make it faster, to make it more efficient, to make it more effective with fewer people, or to get more people involved. Similar. It's similar to the way that any of these ride-sharing systems work. By getting more people into the system and developing better algorithms, we're not necessarily immediately displacing jobs. We're just connecting people to the jobs more efficiently. I think that's a really important aspect that automation can help with.
So I think I might be burying the lead here a bit. You guys are both going to be on the very first breakout panel of the day on artificial intelligence. I think it's about the broadest topic header of any of the presentations today. So do you want to talk a little bit about what your panel presentation is on today, or what are the topics you're drilling down into?
Yeah, sure. So so James talked a lot about kind of the implications of automation and AI for the future of work. I think we'll be talking a lot about that. One of the areas that we're very interested in is the use of artificial intelligence in the government, and particularly in the criminal justice system. This has been a very hot topic recently.
Is it going well? I got to interrupt because I feel like I have strong personal
Is it going
thoughts
well
there.
in the criminal justice system?
I guess. I'm curious. Let's. Maybe this is too strong of an ideological question, but do you think? I imagine there's lots of utility for automation in criminal justice. My initial impulse is that people think it's doing a lot of harm, and at the same time, advocates seem to be suggesting that it's just better than the status quo.
Yeah. So, I think that there's sort of the promise and the reality here, right?
Okay.
The promise is great, right? Theoretically, we could have these systems that avoid all sorts of human bias problems. They can be very transparent. We can figure out exactly how they work. They can be based on scientific principles rather than, I'm sentencing you to, 20 years because I had a bad breakfast this morning. There are studies on that sort of thing. So there's a lot of promise there. There's, right now the state of things is that the technology is much more primitive than what we can imagine. A lot of the sentencing algorithms or the pretrial algorithms that are in use today are just checklists. They're just numbers. They're on the level of a credit score. They're not the sort of complicated AI prediction, human level analysis that we imagine in our heads sometimes. And so I think that's been pretty limiting. And the other problem is that a lot of the companies are very secretive about how these algorithms work. And the secrecy, I think number one has been a big problem for innovation in the field, because you don't have the sort of information sharing among researchers in terms of how some of these algorithms work. And it's been problematic because you don't end up with the sort of fighting between parties that ultimately makes these sorts of things more fair and more understandable, or better for the system overall. So, I think that there's a lot to be said for transparency in these sorts of systems. And once we start getting to that point, I think that we'll start seeing systems used within the criminal justice system and in other places in government that are really effective. But right now, the opaqueness of the system, I think, has been really harmful.
James, I'd like to turn to you quickly. So we were talking about a little bit of the theme of transparency here. What does that impact, and what does that mean in terms for competition? We were discussing earlier that a lot of industries with regard to artificial intelligence are being dominated by key players, and not just the big tech companies, but in every vertical. There's a couple of competitors, and then everyone fighting for scraps.
Yeah, we're seeing this throughout the developed world, that the top companies in each industry are able to utilize IT and better than anybody else. And so they're able to become more productive, they're able to grow faster, they're getting greater market share, they're earning higher profits, and this is upending things in lots of ways. Not necessarily a bad problem. I think it's misunderstood. So we're seeing this rise of industry concentration in people, or rising profits, and some people assume, well, that means that we're having less competition and maybe the antitrust authorities have been too lax in their enforcement. Our evidence seems to be saying, no, it's not because of, overall this trend is not because of lax enforcement. Lax enforcement might still be a problem, but that's not what's driving this trend. It's really technology.
Do things like algorithmic transparency help that, or is it just these companies have so much scale?
So it's about data. This is what it's about. Algorithmic transparency, or we're putting algorithms into place, and you think about the role of regulation or about of third-party insurers or others who can justify for the reliability or safety or unbiasedness of these various algorithms. And in order to do that, you need the data. This is a big difference. Regulation today requires expertise. Regulators rely on experts who can, if I want to judge the safety of an automobile, say, I can get engineers in there and we can do some tests on how fastly it brakes, and we understand that if it brakes in 100 yards under these conditions in the test lab, it's going to do so in conditions throughout highways across America. With something like self-driving automobiles, we have this machine learning technology that learns things, but you don't have that same portability because it's not based on theoretical science, it's based on machine learning. So machines can recognize stop signs, but they don't always recognize stop signs the same way you and I do. So there are computer scientists have these examples where they can show a stop sign that you and I would say, yes, that's a stop sign, but the machine will think it's not. We had a fatality a couple years ago, and apparently it was because a Tesla car on autopilot mistook a trailer truck crossing the road for an overhead sign. You and I wouldn't make that distinction, and those things are going to happen. They may happen very rarely, but the problem is, the point I'm trying to get at, which maybe it's a long and roundabout
all right.
story here, is that in order for insurance companies or government regulators to judge the safety of these new systems, they have to have a lot of data.
Okay.
They either have to have the cars driven Rand estimated that they needed hundreds of billions of miles of driving in order to really evaluate their safety, or you have to provide the data in some other way so that these third parties or government parties can analyze it. And where the data is private, that's an issue.
Well,
James, so one thought that comes to mind from that is, it sounds like data is very important, but also testing is very important, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if this suggests that there's actually an industry for developing AI testers, either automated ones or human ones, who will come up with the weird edge cases and figure out okay, let's make sure that this AI doesn't mistake the truck for a stop sign or something.
Yeah, we basically we're going to need a whole set of new institutions. I mean, we're going to need new rules for sharing the data so that we can have those testers do their work, but we're going to need a new set of institutions and new ways of doing regulation because of this, I think.
How likely do you think it is that we will rise to that challenge?
Oh, I think we'll do it. It's just a question of how painful it will be to get there.
Well, you want to put on some prognosticator hats and let's think about.
Well, I mean, we have some examples of that already, right? Yeah. A lot of the folks in the cybersecurity field, right? They do this sort of thing all the time. The companies will hire people just to press buttons randomly on phones to see if the phone will break or reveal any secrets unintentionally. So I think that there's a burgeoning field of this already, at least within the cybersecurity field, and bringing that out to more general manufacturing and use of AI in all sorts of different fields, I think, will be important. But the seeds of that are already there. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is that cybersecurity is a pretty young field as well, right? And so we haven't brought that down to the point of science, right? It still still requires a lot of training to be able to understand how some of those systems work. So I think that there's going to be some development, some education, and some creativity required before we get to the point of developing the institutions and getting all the data and making sure that we have the systems in place to test these sorts of things. But the seeds are there. And
it should be said that AI itself will be helpful in developing these systems, so that we can have AI machines testing other AI systems.
And then we get into the really scary zone where it starts to.
To the extent that machines can train against other machines. You're still involving very limited domains. You're still requiring human guidance in order to set that up. The great difficulty about machine learning is that it can do very well with very well focused data. It's not able to take a model of abstraction. I mean, the reason that engineers can test brakes on car systems is that we have models of mechanical engineering and physics that tell us how these things work, and we can take that model and apply it. We know it applies generally. Here, we're with machine learning, those systems don't have models. They don't have the abstraction, and so they may identify a face, but they have no idea what the back of the head will look like, whereas I can look at Charles and make a pretty good guess what the back of his head looks like.
I don't know.
Turn around a second. Yeah, not so bad.
For our listeners here, Charles has actually several letters cut into the back of his haircut, and an illustration of like a gavel. No, I'm just kidding.
I think that one of the other interesting things is the communication between systems, which I think, as we've seen in the computer field, has been much more difficult than sort of we would assume. We just sort of assume that like one AI system is going to be able to talk to this other AI system, and that my Internet of Things system in the house is going to communicate with my car, and like everything going to be able to communicate. This has turned out, at least in existing technology, to be much harder than we expect. And this is kind of a problem of what we call interface compatibility. That in order for one computer system to talk to another computer system, they both have to speak the same language. But the companies who develop these systems have very strong incentives to make their languages hard to be spoken by other people, because that maintains the market dominance within their small field, ensures that you have to buy their products. And so, at least in recent years, that's meant that there's been a lot of human involvement required just for translating between systems and developing those sorts of glue pieces that allow my smartphone to talk to my door or something like that. I think that that's going to continue to be a problem until we start seeing companies who are really willing to take advantage of open standards and develop compatible interfaces. And like I said, companies have strong incentives not to do that. So I think that, at least for the time being, until we somehow overcome that sort of internal incentive to
law, cough, cough, regulation, cough, cough.
It's going to be a while before we really start seeing that sort of ability of systems to train each other, because they're just not going to be able to talk to each other. Companies don't have the incentives to allow their systems to do that.
All right, well, Charles and James, your panel starts in, I believe, 25 minutes or so. So I want to thank both of you so much for joining us today. I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to maybe leave one final thought, or if you have maybe a, what do you think is, this is State of the Net 2018, so maybe what is the biggest challenge we're facing specifically this year, short term, for AI?
I think one of the things is that there's just so much to imagine at this point in terms of AI. We have these visions of, driverless cars that know and AI systems that know exactly what we want. And it's very tempting to be scared of those sorts of things. Technology isn't there. It's going to be a long time before we get there, I think. And really, when we're talking about regulation, we're talking about do we need to worry about robots taking over the future? I think it's worth just remembering the technology. It's going to be a long time before we get to the sorts of technologies that lead to the fears that a lot of us like to bring up. Right now, most of the technologies in machine learning or AI that we're talking about are much simpler things that are still requiring humans to work with them. So, I think that some of these fears of, automated systems that are going to just destroy all jobs, or things like that, they're much further away than I think we imagine them to be.
I'll make the same point from a different perspective, which is what we're going to experience over the next 10 or 20 years really isn't going to be very different from what we've experienced already, because we are already experiencing a high degree of computer automation. The first AI systems were put into the field in 1987 for doing credit card fraud. We've been seeing computer automation of all sorts since the 1950s. The first fully automated loan system was, I believe, 1972. We've been doing this for a long time, and you think about automation more generally, we have 200 years of fairly intense automation in many industries. So we've had these fears periodically. There's a cycle of fear, over and over again. You can look back in the 60s and the 30s, in the 19th century, where people were raising these very same issues and very same fears. I'm not saying that things are going to be exactly the same as they were in the past, but at least for the next 10 or 20 years, we're seeing a lot more continuity than discontinuity. That's not to minimize the fact that these are disruptive. I think we're already seeing effects in terms of growing economic inequality, for instance, related to technology, or growing industry concentration related to technology. These things are in the data so far that we see, but it hasn't been the end of the world either.
Thank you, gentlemen. I hope we gave you an opportunity to preview what you're going to be talking about in half an hour.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Excellent. All right, thanks so much. This was great.
Yeah, it was fun.
Hold on, wait, your mic.